So what I'm going to do is talk about my personal experience. To do that, I need to give you a very small amount of information about my experience as a teacher in higher education, because I think that gives you a context for the way that I developed my personal journey. I'm going to talk a little bit about my disciplinary research background, because although I now identify myself as someone who does educational inquiry, scholarship, teaching and learning, whatever word we want to use for it, in the teaching of biology in a higher education context and more broadly in a higher education context. It depends who asks me that question. You ask me that question, that's the answer I give. Most people answer that question and I tell them I'm a biologist, because that's how I identify based on my early experience. And that shapes the way I think about educational inquiry. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the motivations and enablers that have helped me or held me back or made me stronger as we've gone through that 25-year journey, and how that has applied to those around me as well, my observation of people through my roles as a head of department, as a mentor, as an editor, as someone who organises meetings like this, that kind of thing. So that gives me a level of insight into the ways that other people are interacting with this journey as well. There might be the odd word of caution in there, but mostly it's going to be words of encouragement, which I think it's really important. And it is great to see, I don't want to echo what everybody else said, and we take it for granted now, but to see this many people interested in talking about the teaching of their discipline. 15 years ago in Hull, 20 years ago in Hull, as we'll see, I was talking to myself in a corridor. We wouldn't have got that, and now we can do this as well. We have this many people we can gather in a room. So in terms of my teaching, I don't know, can you see the pictures there in this light? Is that okay? So in terms of my teaching, I'm a biologist, I'm an ecologist, so a lot of my teaching takes place on lovely sunny days outside. The biologists in the room know that's a lie. On lovely sunny days outside with students gathered around something happening in the outside world. A lot of my teaching takes place in white coats, in a crowded laboratory, lots of exciting things going on with equipment and things that go beep and coloured liquids going backwards and forwards, because that's what everyone thinks science is, so we do a lot of that kind of thing. Of course, I give lectures down here, but more and more, a lot of my work has been through small group work and working with students in a problem-solving, student-centred way. So that's the kind of teaching experiences that I come from. Now, my research bias is that I am a scientist, and naively, or perhaps some of you would say arrogantly, most scientists think there is only one approach to research, which is the positivist research paradigm, and there is the scientific method with the emphasis on the as an exclusive way of carrying out research, and everybody else's research isn't proper because it's not science. That's kind of how we're indoctrinated and how we're brought up. And I think I can see some nods there, and I can see some disapproving faces, but that's the truth of the situation. That's how scientists are raised. We have very firm ideas about the primacy of experimental design, about controls, about changing one variable at a time, about things being neat and replicable. We've got very firm ideas about data. Data are essentially numbers. And the more numbers you've got, the better your data are. If you can't measure it or count it, it's probably not data. We've got very, very strong ideas about what we do with those numbers and the primacy of the p-value, and the more complicated the statistics you can do, the better your science is. I'm laughing at myself here a little bit, but that kind of is how we're raised as scientists. And interestingly, we keep very detailed lab and field notebooks. We reflect on what we do all of the time. We make observations of what we're doing all the time as scientists, but we very rarely treat that as data. We don't perceive that to be data, because it's not numbers. So that's kind of where I start this journey as a scientist who thinks that way. So the structure for this short presentation talk is going to be, I'm going to give you examples of the things I was doing around educational inquiry and how at that time the dissemination was happening, to use that as a scaffold to take you through the last, I'm going to do it day by day, but the last 25 years or so, and think about how it's worked. So in terms of practice, my teaching started essentially teaching the way that I was taught, doing what felt natural, what worked for me. That's the familiar start point. But as we teach, as we start to tweak. I was changing little bits of what I was doing. But I wasn't really disseminating that. I was effectively talking to myself. And I have to say, I felt like I was talking to myself for a very long time. Not literally, obviously, just in my head, having those conversations. And then as you become successful, as you said, you start to think, well, this little tweak worked, that little tweak worked, maybe I can make a bigger change, perhaps I could change something more. And I think of that as a shift from reactive tweaking to purposeful change. And I think that's an important threshold, and that's something that we all go through. Now, at that point, you have to get permission to do that purposeful change. So that means you have to start to talk about this with at least your immediate peers, the people you share a course with, the people who manage your course. Perhaps you have to get permission of someone more senior in your department. But I think for many of us, that's the beginning of dissemination. That's the point where we start to say, this is what I do in my practice, and this is how I will do it in my practice. And I think it's important to go right back to that very first point and think about that's where dissemination starts. I think as a result of that dissemination, we are then challenged by those around us to say, how do you know it will work? How do you know it has worked? What evidence will you have? And that's where we start to make that shift towards relatively light touch evaluation. We start to use things like, well, it must have worked because the marks went up. We could leave it at that, but with my science head on, I think, how do I know that this thing that I changed is the thing that made the marks go up? Because there are all these other things that have changed, different set of students, different weather, different whatever it was in the field, all sorts of things. So we start to think about, this isn't really good enough. At the same time, of course, people like the front row here are saying to us, you're doing something interesting and innovative. You've made a purposeful change. This could have an impact somewhere. Why don't you come to a meeting like this and talk about it? First time I was asked to do that, I was terrified. I was used to giving presentations at disciplinary conferences and thought nothing of it. I'd go and present an idea, something unfounded there. But coming to something like this and talking about a change I had made to my very personal practice and sharing what I thought was an evaluation, knowing that the audience weren't scientists and the scientists in the room would probably just tear it apart anyway, because that's what they do. And that's fine, that's what we do. That was really daunting. So that then puts into your head this seed of, am I the right person to be doing this? And this is the beginning, I think, of imposter syndrome and self-doubt and those sorts of crippling, holding you back kinds of things that we all talk about all the time now. For me, though, the real switch was starting to do that in Hull and feeling very uncomfortable, but having an inspirational mentor in the form of Tina Overton. And if you tweet Tina, there isn't an education conference in science in the country that doesn't have a tweet about Tina Overton in it somewhere. Tina is a chemist. She was the head of the Higher Education Academy's Physical Sciences subject centre, discipline centre, and that was based in Hull. I didn't know that in biology, the building next door, but she saw me at one of these talks and she said, what you're doing is sufficiently interesting to be talked about beyond Hull. The people in Hull aren't going to listen to you. People outside will listen to you. Go out and talk to people. So she got me to go along to things like HEA discipline events, the bioscience subject centre that we had, to go and talk about what I was doing with a group of like-minded people, other biologists who were interested in how we teach biology rather than what we teach in biology. And being part of that nurturing community, because we didn't realise that's what we were then, but looking back, that's what we have been. Being part of that nurturing community helps you to sort of build that sense of personal strength. I can do this. This is something I can do. I can be part of this. And that is the point where I think you're ready to then start thinking about, let's push this out there and publish it. Let's share it through one of the disciplinary specific journals or something. In those days, we had Bioscience Education and an HEA journal. Now, Higher Education Pedagogical might be an equivalent kind of thing. And there are other vehicles out there that we could use. So I've gone from teaching because that's how I learned, to teaching because I think I can do it better, to evaluating that in a light touch, to then questioning the data that I'm using and thinking about how I'm going to work with that. The next key step, I think, is to make that shift from sharing what I think of at this stage as descriptions of light touch evaluation descriptions of practice. I did this in my class once, this is what happened and this is what I think, that kind of thing, which has value, I think, but we also realise has limitation. And as a scientist, the next key step for me was to say, right, well, let's test this experimentally. Let's take some of the ideas and do proper experiments with proper data that we can use to convince other scientists that this is a good thing. Now, at that time, so I'm going to put an example in here of a piece of work I did, a piece of work called The Value of Fieldwork. And this is clearly working within my comfort zone. So it's the teaching that's happening there is the stuff that I did in my research at the time as an ecologist. And the approach I've taken is the experiment approach. I looked in my module, found two activities that essentially could be as similar as possible whilst being different. The top one is students collecting sand from a beach in Scarborough, and what they're going to do is they're going to extract the organisms that live in that sand and they're going to identify them, they're going to learn what they are, and they're going to learn about that technique. The bottom picture is essentially exactly the same, but the sand is in a riverbed. So in my science head, very little changes here. What changes here is the way that I get them to do the exercise. In the sand exercise, we didn't go out and physically collect the stuff. We showed them how it was done and we presented them with the sample. In the other exercise, we physically went out, they collected the stuff and they did the whole process themselves. So the only difference is, essentially, they're not digging a hole and they're not putting sand through a sieve. So not much of a difference there. But in terms of various ways that we could then measure that, and of course I was really interested in marks because they're numbers, so we set the students various tests after a period of, immediately and then after a period of time that we could break down into numbers where they did essentially the same assessments with one set of data and the other set of data. And we flipped them round, so half the class did it one way and half the class did it the other way, and we had a controlled experiment and we found a p-value that said that students learn better when they've actually done this in the field, which of course we probably already knew, but we didn't know in this context. And the driver for this piece of work was a head of department telling me that fieldwork was too expensive. Actually, you know, if there are biochemists or others in the room, this fieldwork costs the price of a coach to go 20 minutes, you know, a few £100. How much is that compared to a lab session? You know, so fieldwork isn't expensive, but this was a vehicle for me to try and say this how it is. But this example is there, but this example is very clearly in my comfort zone. I've tried to make this science, essentially, I think. Now, as I was trying to write this up, and I will be honest with you, the way I wrote this up was to do my experiment, write it, and then try and find references to put back into it, because that was at the beginning of my journey. I started to realise that there was a theory around this. There was a theoretical framework that I could sit this inside. There was a rich literature on this kind of thing that I could draw into this. Going back a little bit, I was obviously aware of that. That wasn't absolute revelation to me. I was aware there was literature to it. And way back at that purposeful change stage, I did at that point think, actually, maybe what I need to do is to use the science method or the research method, disciplinary research method, go and find out what has already been done and work. So I went to a library. I randomly picked out recent copies of 4 different important sounding higher education journals and skimmed through them, and after half an hour decided this was an alien language and not one that I could understand or read. So I just switched off right back at the early stage, and the literature had no place for me at the early stage because I just didn't know how to access it. I should have gone to a librarian, I should have gone to somebody else, I should have asked for some help, but I didn't. I couldn't read it, so I went back to the science literature. So at the bottom here now, so I've tested my ideas experimentally, I've published that paper and some other papers using a similar kind of a model. I'm going around conferences talking to them. I'm realising that there is a literature, there is a theoretical context to all of this that I can ground that in. That again is, I think of these as kind of threshold moments. This is a moment of change in the way I'm thinking. And at the same time, I started talking to students. Now this is relatively late, and obviously I've been talking to students all the way through this, I'm a teacher, but I started talking to students here about educational inquiry, educational research, not using those words, just talking about improving the programme. And not in the sense that often we see where we talk to students, where we get them in the room and we say, what went well, what went badly, what could we do differently, but actually sharing with them things like the results of that paper and saying, how does this make you feel about how we tackle fieldwork? You know, involving them in the interpretation of the research that I was finding, or if I was changing the way we were going to teach something and basing it on something that I'd read in the literature, talking to the students saying, we're going to do it this way because this paper says this is the way that we should be doing this kind of thing, trying to involve students in that conversation. That was interesting because, well, many of the students actually weren't interested, but many of the students that were interested gave me back good ideas and talked to me about ideas. And the next very short case study I'm going to show you was stimulated by a student comment in one of those discussions. So this is a module, finally a module called Whales, Dolphins and Sharks that was cynically invented in a marine biology degree because if you put those words in, you recruit twice as many students. This was prospectus fill. There wasn't a module there, and 5 years later, when we get to the first third year run through, the head of department looked for someone to teach it. I had nothing to do, so he gave me the module to teach. Fortuitously, a couple of things align there. One is, I knew vaguely something about whales, sharks and dolphins, so I was probably okay with that kind of stuff. I've been thinking about educational theory, and in particular Kolb's experiential learning, and how that resonates with the way we do field work, but how might we apply that cycle to a classroom-based activity in science. So that was in my head. But what was most important was the top bullet point in that list. The list there is for me, not for you. They're very small words. It was, in one of those conversations, one of the students has said to me, all this research is all very well, but actually what you need to do is ask us what we want to learn, not how we want to learn it. And this student made the point that she'd come to university to be a biologist. She'd spent 2.5 years at that point being a biologist and hadn't got to learn about the thing she was interested in. And I think that was wolves. Yeah. Very, very specific. Now, our answer is, well, we taught you about the biology of this, the biology of that, the biology of the other. You can apply that to wolves. And she said, no, I didn't want all that. I want to learn about wolves. Now, in marine biology, students want to learn about whales, dolphins, and sharks. So this module was conceived as a module with no content where the students would be able to decide what about those things they wanted to learn. It was a module delivered through facilitated small group work because not everybody in the room wanted to learn the same thing. And it was a module where the only disciplinary content, the only stuff I have to give them is one of these little pieces up here, which is a clipping from New Scientist in those days we used. Clipping from New Scientist, a few hundred words about a recent advance in science to do with a whale, a dolphin, or a shark. And the students take that, and working together, they share their knowledge, they work out what they know about that, what they don't know about that, what they don't want to know about that, what they do want to know about that. And over the course of a cycle of learning, they work together to produce the answers to what we want to know in the form of an authentic output, a book, multi-authored piece that could be used by others to learn the thing that they think is interesting. Very briefly, I don't want to go into the detail of this example, but very briefly, the key bits in this are that the students get the trigger that I've talked about in the first week of the course here. And these are typically 5 students, self-selecting group working together. They read it, they share some information about it, they talk about what they already know. Now these students are in the final year, so they've all got a different catalogue of modules behind them. So they've got lots of different knowledge and experience. They can all be an expert on something, which I think is really important. They share all of that, and they set their own learning goals. They decide, of all of this stuff, these are the 5 things that we're going to learn about that connect in some way to produce a coherent 5-chapter booklet about the whale, the shark, or the dolphin, or the biology, or whatever. We don't say that it has to be linked to that article, it has to be derived from that article. So my favourite example is an article about whales eating herring. But the book that was written was about how shoaling fish like herring managed to stay in close proximity to one another. So it had nothing to do with whales, sharks, and dolphins at all. But the learning outcome for the module didn't require them to learn about that, it required them to learn about something of biological interest stimulated by that. So we got around that way. After 5 weeks of thinking, discussing, researching, working together, the students submit for summative assessment their book, and they give that to me. And a week later, each individual student submits their own assessment of that book using the same assessment criteria that I've used. So these T's here. T1 is tutor-marked first book. This is student-marked first book. A week later, the students get feedback. They get the mark that I've given. They get feedback from me or the other tutor doing the course, so they get lots of feedback from us. But they also get to share the marks that they each thought the piece was worth and the feedback that they'd all written for each other on that as well. And we do that in a discussion. So we're having a conversation about feedback and the use of feedback and all of that kind of thing. And we talk a lot about the similarities or differences between the assessment here and the assessment there. There's a period of reflection, and we run through the whole process again with a new trigger article, and this time the students submit for summative assessment the piece of work that I mark. And initially, I didn't think to get them to reassess the thing, the second one. Later on, we added that in. But in the next example I'm going to show you some results from this. We do have that. So basically here, we've got another 2 assessments, a summative tutor assessment of the second piece and a formative student assessment of the second piece. What I was interested in was the value of allowing the students to determine their own curriculum, because that was where my start point for this was. Over the 13 or so years that this module ran, what I became more interested in was the value of this process and the value of that conversation about feedback. And this work's been published in Higher Education Pedagogics, actually. And here are some results from it. The first thing to look at is just that top slide up there, because when I set out, that was all I really cared about. That's marks. So that's the average mark. Each dot is the average mark achieved on one of the assessments. So the first dot is the average mark the student thought that first piece of work was worth. And the second dot is the average mark it actually got. So they're over-marking considerably. The students think the work is worth much more than it actually is. These two dots here, though, are the student's assessment and my assessment of the second piece. And the two take-home bits from that for me, in terms of what I expected from the module, what I wanted was that marks go up, so the students get better as a result of practice, they're doing it twice, and the conversation about feedback, I would suggest. But they're also better at recognising the quality of their work. Or cynically, you might say recognising what I think is the quality of their work. But they're better able to pitch their assessment. And for a long time, I would go to conferences like this, and I would talk about this as a huge success, and I would talk about that module, and people would ask me the question, they would say, do all the students like it, do all the students improve, do all the students do equally well? And I would just say, well, you know, the average mark is. And I thought very much about the average, because that, again, is a science thing. We tend to think we get all this data, and there's too much, so we group it together to be the average, and we talk about the average student. And of course, through conversations with students, I realised that there is no such thing as the average student, they're all individuals. And then this second piece, the bigger figure here, this is a plot of the difference between the mark that I gave for the first piece of work and this mark that the student gave itself for the first piece of work. So the red line would be if we agreed. And the majority of students do over-assess, but there are a good number of students that significantly under-assess. They don't think their work is good enough. Anecdotally, I had it in my head that these tended to be the better students, based on the other modules they were doing, and when I plotted the data out this way, then I realised those actually are the students who are the better students, because they're the ones who were doing the better work. And I used this example is there because in order to explain this kind of thing, or to do that light touch evaluation initially with this kind of thing, I needed to learn a new way of thinking about data. Because I had to understand why those students under-assess and over-assess. And obviously, if I'd set out to do this, I might have done it slightly differently, but I was lucky in that I had a body of information I could draw on, because each student, when they did their assessment of the first piece of work, had written me an explanation of why they'd assessed it that way. So they'd written me a commentary that I could then analyse. I didn't know how to analyse it, so talking to Antigone, one of the biologists who'd been at those biology meetings I'd been at, she said, what you need to do is you need to do some sort of textual thematic analysis. It's a social science thing. Go and read about it. Go and find out. So I did a light touch read of all of these things and tried to work it out. And of course, what it showed me was that these students up here, when they talk about why the work is worth a very high mark, they're focusing what I label as quite superficial things. I worked a lot. I wrote a lot. It's got more references than it ever had before. We spent a long time on it. That kind of thing. So it must be good. Whereas these students down here, these ones there, they taught in a much more critical way about, we used lots of references, but I'm aware that the literature is bigger and there are these other things that I couldn't access and I couldn't find, so it can't be good enough because I didn't find every single reference there ever is, that kind of thing is a simple experiment. But essentially what they were doing was they were demonstrating a much more nuanced understanding of the assessment criteria, the way we use them and the things that were. So I'm not going to talk about that anymore. The reason I've got this here is to make this point that at this point I had to make a mental shift from being the scientist thinking about the numbers to start to think about the experience of the students, their observations and their words. And suddenly words become data as well. And for me that's another threshold, that's an alien concept and a strange shift. So back to my timeline. I'm now challenging myself because I'm starting to think about other forms of data, which is really interesting. And to think about other forms of data, I'm having to develop new collaborations, new methodologies, new relationships, and talk to a whole new set of people and not just come along to these meetings and think, oh, that's interesting, but that's not science. How can I possibly understand that? I think instead, that's interesting. I need to talk to that person and understand how that's relevant to my students, because it's not about science, it's about teaching. And whether you're a music student or an English student or a history student or a science student, it's about teaching and how do we generalize these things and how do we find the meaning in that piece of work in our context. And I think that's really important. The other thing that those kinds of conversations make you think about is the scale of the inquiry. So in that first experiment, my sample size was very small because it was a one-off. We did it in 1 year. We did it and we published that because we just wanted to prove our point. We did that. This other thing was 13 years in the making, lots of thinking along the way, an N of a few hundred students, quite a small module this one, so not big class sizes, but it took a long time to do it. and a shift in the way that I thought about things as I was going, and more than one thing changing along the way as we went. So not the nice, tidy, controlled experiment that we thought about before. The other important thing that started to happen then is that once you're publishing your stuff outside and talking about these bigger samples, the people inside start to listen to you, particularly when you receive awards, labels, you get funding, those sorts of things, the kinds of metrics that we're more used to using to congratulate our disciplinary research colleagues, or the colleagues who are involved in disciplinary research, or we receive when we're involved in disciplinary research, those kinds of things. And so you start to have an element of institutional influence, and you need to think about how can that be used, initially within your own area, in the department, in the program, but then how can that spread out to other areas as well. Now, of course, anyone could have told me that 25 years ago, well, not 25 years ago, it's 2000, but in the past, I could have just gone along and the journey that I've just described, other people have written down. It's very straightforward. It's the kind of classic track for someone moving from a disciplinary background into the scholarship of teaching and learning. And for me, the model that resonates with this really, really nicely is Trigwell's multidimensional model of subtle. So I started at the top there with these very informal ideas about what I was doing, very, very me-focused about my teaching. And then I passed through all of these stages, and I would argue that somewhere I'm down at that 3 and 4 level, thinking about learning in a student-focused way, purposefully changing the way that I do things and carrying out research and coming to things like this. So that's the journey. I was made aware of that again by Anne Tierney, who I keep name dropping, invited her something, she's great. Anne Tierney, who's at Edinburgh Napier, she does work on this. She's very interested in We Are the Data. She's interested in how academics in a teaching-focused role, or an increasingly teaching-focused role, or making the shift from a research-focused to a teaching-focused role, either voluntarily, purposefully, or because of other reasons, how they identify themselves, how they develop their careers, and all that kind of thing is interesting. So she listened to me talking about all this stuff once and said, well, you're just describing Trigwell. Go and read Trigwell, and then reflect on what you've done. And then she invited me to go and talk about my experience at a meeting about how we disseminate science. That I think Ellie was at, when we were talking about Twitter and the other things at that meeting. I was asked to go along and tell the story that I've just told you. Now, suddenly, I'm not talking to people like you, I'm talking to a load of my peers in science, in biology. So I panicked and thought, it's not good enough to talk about this. What I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to get some data to demonstrate that I'm right. So I did a piece of work where I interviewed, another new method for me. I talked to Anne and said, how on earth how do I prove that this is not just me? Because the rest of the room will say, well, that's just you. You're different. And she said, well, you can't carry out a piece of research. Interview some people, find out whether their story is the same as your story. So I had to go away and learn another new technique, go and talk to people in Hull about how you do interviews, that kind of thing. I set out to do 200 interviews, and then somebody else said, don't be ridiculous, this isn't science, think about a smaller number, do a small number of interviews that use the time you've got until you're not getting any new information, that kind of approach. I went through it. So I did a piece of work that I titled, Why Do We Bother? And the question I asked myself was, why do biologists take the time to talk to other biologists about the way they teach, rather than just getting on with it and doing their biological research? So I interviewed a set of people that I considered to be my peers, people who had started the journey at the same time as me and who I had encountered disseminating their science beyond their institution. So people that were publishing or presenting at national level meetings. I interviewed those and asked them questions about their journey. And I interviewed another group of people who were early career academics that I was meeting at the same event who were presenting or who were publishing. So they'd kind of leapfrogged my 20-odd years and had gone straight in at that point. And they were biologists. And I thought that was interesting because they might be different to me. Actually, they're very similar. There's a subtle difference, but very similar. And the way I did this was I framed the piece of work around what are the costs and benefits, what are the disablers and enablers to being part of this journey. I think that's relevant to talking about here very briefly. So the disablers, you could tell me them, I'm sure. I could have not put that up. I could have asked you to shout them out, and we'd have ended up with this list. Because the kind of people I was talking to are people like you. Some of the costs were middle managers, some of the disablers rather. So the costs, the main cost that people perceived were that it took too much time and that it would hamper your promotion chances. This was certainly the case in my peers, who at that point we didn't have the kind of track that I got my chair on and that scholarship focus track. We didn't have that at that point. So there was a perception that this would hamper your promotion because you weren't going to get promoted for this kind of stuff. And it took up time, which was linked to that because it was time you should be spending on other things. So that was one of the costs. The benefits, of course, were that you were recognised for something you were proud of and you were good at, either internally or externally by peers. The sense of satisfaction of doing the job that you loved doing was another benefit people talked about. People was a benefit, being part of a community of like-minded people. Somebody in the introduction, I think in the previous, he talked about that lone worker model for the teaching. You know, for a long time I was literally talking to myself in our biology department. Now there are half a dozen of us who are doing this kind of work, as well as doing biology work. And then the rest of the department are at least literate and understand what we're doing. So, you know, that's a big shift in 20 years to go from being the one to being part of a community. And being part of that community as it developed was important. And in later stages, some people in those institutions that do have that proper track saw promotion because there was a promotion route there as a benefit. So the disablers were middle managers with other priorities who have to manage. And having been a middle manager with other priorities, I understand where that comes from. I think there are different ways we can handle it, but I understand where it comes from. That tension between research and teaching, reluctant colleagues that won't let you do the experiment you want to do with your teaching because it impacts on their teaching. Those kinds of things. And that might be because you want to change a module that puts them outside of their comfort zone if it's a shared module, for example. Imposter syndrome and self-doubt were disablers. This idea that one person I was talking to who is a professor in biology and does this kind of stuff and publishes in high-impact education journals, keeps talking about when they retire they're going to do a PhD in education because that will validate them as an education researcher. And you think, well, I think your publications do that for you. You don't need to do that PhD. But still at that stage, she thinks that she really does need to go back and do that because that would then validate all of this and this perceived lack of reward. The enablers, though, were really important mentors. I've talked about Anne T and I've talked about Tina Owen. I've dropped some names there. People who make a difference to the way we work. Supportive senior leaders, the kinds of people that enable this sort of thing to happen and will give people time and will put in place schemes to reward and support this kind of work, and the sim line managers. Being part of that community, the recognition and the reward. The thing that I found really quite interesting was the subtle difference between those two communities that I interviewed. The 20-odd year long service peers got into this kind of stuff from a sense of need. It was an internal driver. They wanted to do this. Those early career people I talked to didn't use the same kind of language. They talked about it as requirement. They'd made a conscious decision to apply for a teaching-focused role that required scholarship. They were doing a PCAP course that had a module that required them to do a bit of research. So they were doing it because they had to do it. And I think that's an interesting difference and one that I think would warrant a little bit more investigation, but I'm not at the moment, but I think that would be an interesting place to go next. And I think what I'm trying to get across here is that it's really essential to understand this journey from novice to expert. So in this one of our modules here, students start by dangling 2 feet off the ground trying to learn how to harness themselves, and by the end of the module they're whipping up trees and the risk assessment's a nightmare, but they're whipping up trees, competently expert in tree climbing. I think what we need to do is we need to start by embracing our novice status when we start out. We might be a professor of biology, but when it comes to biological education, we might actually be something more akin to a PhD student when we start thinking. Probably a good one, but something like that. So we need to think about embracing that novice status and not being afraid to look for and ask for support, particularly when it comes to translating that unfamiliar literature. We wouldn't start a new piece of, I'll tell you this to the biologists, we wouldn't start a new piece of biology research without understanding what had been done first. And yet, as biology teachers, we're happy to start a new piece of educational inquiry without bothering to find out what's been done first. I think that's changing, but that's certainly been my experience in the past, not personal experience, but also the experience of the people that I observe. And as an editor, that's feedback that I often have to give. This is a really nice piece of work, but you really need to ground this in the literature because there's so much more that's been done already that you need to find out about. We need to understand paradigms from the disciplinary areas. I think that's really important. And I think we need to be happy to embrace new methods and new data, but not to reinvent them, to take advice, to work in collaboration and partnership. And we need to constantly chip away at that imposter syndrome. Good place to start, this isn't a shameless plug because I've only got one chapter in this book, but a good place to start is this book by Cleaver, Linton and Linden, Teaching and Learning in Higher Education. That's the second edition. The first edition is very subtly different. they've got a set of chapters in there that basically tell the kind of story I've talked about with examples and with good tips on what to do and how to do things in each of the disciplinary areas. So Anne and I did a chapter there that's highlighted on Enquiry into Learning and Teaching in the Life Sciences. The one above it is about maths and engineering. The one below it is about the arts and creative practices. So in this edition or the first edition, the lists were slightly different depending on the authors that they used. There will be a chapter somewhere. So if you're at the beginning of that journey and you want a place to start, that textbook effectively is a really good place to start. One of the other things that we're doing is we're using the theory in Hull, we're using theory to try and drive the development of practice in a CPD sense. So this is a diagram, a model from a paper by Kern, similar to the Trigwell thing. This comes from work that Peter Draper and I have been doing together, and this is Peter's. I was doing it with Trigwell. I was using that table and saying to our colleagues, you're here, let's talk about how you move down this. Use this as a roadmap, a purposeful thing. Peter uses this diagram instead, which I think is a nice one because it focuses on all of the activities related to teaching and dissemination. So the way this works is that we've got dissemination and sharing our teaching at that side of the diagram, and at this side we've got the things that we actually do, the practice. So in this bottom corner, which you can't read, that says developing a lesson, but across here it says doing a blog about teaching. At the bottom we've got relatively informal things, blogging, those sorts of things. At the top we've got more systematic things. So at this side we've got the kind of scholarly teaching that I described at the beginning of the Trigwell thing, the light touch evaluation, the what works, why does it work, how does it work. And at that side we've got level 4 in Trigwell where we're talking about systematic research, having an impact across a discipline or beyond, doing work that's grounded in literature in a purposeful way, peer-reviewed output. And what we do in our CPD sessions with anyone who's interested in embarking on this kind of pathway is we invite them. We've got one of these that is like a big twister mat, and we invite them to put a post-it with their name on the things that they do, different colour for different people. And we use that to visualise the different skill sets individuals would have, so they can then work together as a community to talk about, well, you're doing this, how did you get from that bit to that bit? But also so that they can see where they are, and we get them to talk about where they want to be, and then we get them to talk about what route might take you to one to the other, and how can the people in the session around you, your near peers, but also your mentors, I guess, people like me doing the sessions, how can they help you to navigate that journey? So I think using, I doubt that Kern intended it that way, but using this kind of diagrammatic representation of our academic work is a useful way for us to position dissemination in interesting ways. And this encourages us to think about dissemination not just as peer-reviewed outputs, but think about dissemination in that much wider sense that's possible. So the blogging, the presentations, the talking to students, the talking to peers, the various educational materials that we produce, all of that kind of thing, dissemination in its widest sense. My final slide, I've reached the end of the time, is I think that the lone worker model doesn't really work in the scholarship of teaching and learning or educational inquiry. I think it's where we start, but we need to be part of a community. So I would encourage, the PVC talked about getting the number of somebody. I would reinforce that message. I would encourage more than just casual contact. I would encourage thinking about structures, thinking about formal ways to bring people together to maximise our output, the way we do it in our discipline, certainly in science, which I can speak of with any authority, but the lab group, the collaboration, the 23 authors or 200 authors if you're a physicist on a paper, those kinds of, think in those kinds of terms. Who do we need to involve in order to take us to the next step? So in Hull, what we've done is we have a biology education research group, which has got, there's only 5 in that cartoon, because we haven't got a cartoon for the new guy yet, but there's 6. And one of those people actually is Stuart McGugan, who I believe was here as an educational developer, and he's now in Hull as an educational developer. He's not a biologist, but he's part of the biology education research group because we work with Stuart to provide support directly to the scientists on his PCAP course, because the scientists on the PCAP, the Postgraduate Certificate in Academic Practice course, they felt that it was too social science and they wanted some science in there. So we put the science in and then help them to understand the meaning for the social science. They go that way. And what we do as a group is we try to have an impact on our students, either directly through changing our own teaching or bringing people in. So we invited Susan to come and talk. I'd heard Susan speak, Susan Vocal there, I'd heard her speak about work that she'd done at an SEB meeting in Brighton, possibly, I think that was where I heard that one, and invited you to come to Hull and give a similar presentation. And as a result of the presentation that Susan gave about the way that she teaches one of her modules, we changed the way we run our foundation programme. That had a real impact at a programme level in our institution. Retention increased, marks went up, students are happier, as a dean I'm happier, You know, so we try to find ways to have individual and group impact. We're primarily driven by our desire to carry out research and inquiry, so that's a big part of what we do. But we are also very keen to champion the role of the educational focused academic in a disciplinary context. So we try to promote reward and recognition, either through the kind of influence that I as a dean can have at the institutional level, or through the learning societies, getting them to embrace the kind of things that we want to talk about. So Dom Henry, who's part of this group, is working in the British Ecological Society at the moment with an early career network, specifically to champion the needs of early career academics who are teaching focused, who are often quite isolated in their institution. So we're doing all of that kind of thing. I'm going to leave it there. The other figures were things I was going to talk about in case I had more time. So they're just fill, but I can talk about those another day. So thank you, I'll leave it there.
Thank you.